The wind that crossed barren ridges and ancient stone fields carried more certainty than any banner. Time moved without witness. Paths worn into stone by generations of quiet movement led nowhere quickly, but always somewhere lasting. No capitals yet, no kings, only hands shaping earth and fire into permanence. Cold light touched the hills where settlements held their ground against distance and season. Memory settled into the terrain long before names did. This was not a birthplace of empires, but something older, a place where resilience became architecture and survival turned to tradition. It was never isolated. Forces moved through it, paused, stayed. The land didn't forget. Before conquest, before script, before borders were drawn and redrawn, there was this. A world built not to shine, but to remain. To understand what Armenia would become, we begin here, on a plateau that asked for nothing and endured everything, high in the mountains where 3 continents converge. An inland sea shimmered beneath volcanic peaks that pierced the sky like ancient spears. Lake Van stretched across a landscape sculpted by fire and ice, its alkaline waters fed by snowmelt from summits that touched the heavens. Here, in this natural citadel of stone and storm, geography itself had conspired to create one of the world's great crossroads, a bridge between the cultures of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Iranian plateau. The lake's formation, millions of years earlier, had blocked ancient river channels, creating a natural basin that collected not only water, but the ambitions of peoples who recognized its strategic value. Fresh water in abundance, natural defensive barriers, and commanding views across trade routes that connected distant worlds. These advantages would draw successive waves of settlers who understood that whoever controlled this mountain realm could influence the flow of commerce and conquest across half the known world. The Bronze Age peoples who first established permanent settlements around these waters belonged to cultures that archaeologists would later name Trialeti and Kura Araxes. These early inhabitants mastered the arts of metalworking in workshops where copper and tin were transformed into tools that revolutionized agriculture and weapons, that gave their warriors decisive advantages over enemies still relying on stone implements. Their burial mounds, scattered across the mountain slopes, contained bronze daggers, silver vessels, and intricate jewelry that spoke of sophisticated craftsmanship and far-reaching trade connections. These mountain peoples developed innovations perfectly suited to their harsh environment. They learned to channel mountain streams through elaborate irrigation networks that transformed elevated plateaus into productive agricultural land. Their settlements, positioned on elevated terraces that commanded views across the surrounding countryside, combined defensive advantages with access to fertile soil and reliable water sources. Most importantly, they established traditions of stronghold construction that would influence defense throughout this region for millennia. The transition to iron changed everything. During the early first millennium BC, these mountain peoples gained advantages that would prove decisive in their interactions with lowland neighbors. The peaks contained rich iron deposits, and local smiths developed techniques for producing steel of exceptional quality. Iron plowshares enabled more intensive agriculture on mountain terraces, while iron weapons provided overwhelming superiority over bronze-armed enemies. This metallurgical expertise would become a cornerstone of mountain power for centuries to come. Into this world of stone citadels and terraced fields came the people who would build the realm of Urartu. Around 860 BC, local chieftains began consolidating their control over settlements scattered throughout the Armenian mountains, creating the first territorial state in this crossroads region. Their capital, established on the eastern shore of Lake Van, bore the name Tushpa, a city that would grow to rival the greatest urban centers of the ancient Near East. The rise of Urartu represented more than simple political consolidation. These mountain rulers understood that their realm's position enabled them to influence events across vast distances, provided they could develop the capabilities necessary to project power beyond their natural boundaries. The state they created would become one of the ancient world's most formidable powers, challenging even the mighty Assyrian Empire at the height of its dominance. King Menua, who ruled during the early 8th century BC, transformed the mountain state from a collection of fortified settlements into a sophisticated power capable of monumental projects and systematic territorial growth. His greatest achievement was providing reliable water to Tushpa through one of the ancient world's most ambitious hydraulic projects. The Shamram Canal, carved through bedrock for over 50 kilometers, channeled mountain spring water to the growing capital through engineering that demonstrated capabilities rivaling those of any contemporary power. When foreign delegations visited Tushpa and observed fresh mountain water flowing through the heart of the city, they understood they were witnessing the achievements of a truly formidable state. Throughout the mountain realm, Menua's architects constructed strongholds positioned to control crucial passes and command views across major trade routes. These citadels followed standardized designs that maximized defensive advantages while providing adequate space for garrison forces and storage of supplies needed to withstand extended sieges. The religious traditions that emerged under Menua's patronage synthesized local mountain beliefs, with cultural elements absorbed from contact with neighboring powers. The supreme deity, Haldi, occupied the central position in a pantheon that included Te-Sheba, god of storms and war, and Shavini, deity of the sun and light. Temples constructed to honor these gods featured distinctive elements that would influence sacred building throughout the region for centuries. More importantly, the theological framework developed during this period provided ideological justification for territorial growth by presenting rule as the earthly expression of divine order. Agishti I, Menua's successor, inherited a state positioned to challenge every major power in the ancient Near East. His campaigns extended authority into regions that had never before acknowledged mountain sovereignty, while his building projects rivaled the greatest achievements of contemporary powers. The new city he founded, Erebuni, would eventually evolve into Yerevan, one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited urban centers. Erebuni demonstrated the sophisticated urban planning capabilities that distinguished mature civilization in these mountains. Unlike earlier settlements that had grown organically over generations, this new foundation was designed from the beginning as a command center capable of governing distant territories. Its citadel, constructed on an elevated platform that commanded views across the surrounding countryside, contained palace complexes, temple buildings, and archive facilities that could support the bureaucratic activities required by territorial governance. Agishti's innovations transformed the nature of mountain warfare through systematic application of new approaches and tactics. His forces pioneered the use of heavy cavalry that could operate effectively in mountainous terrain, providing mobility advantages that enabled rapid response to threats across the realm's extended frontiers. More importantly, his siege specialists developed techniques specifically adapted to mountain conditions, enabling systematic reduction of strongholds that had previously been considered impregnable. The deportation policies implemented during Agishti's reign established patterns that would influence demographic composition throughout the region for centuries. Rather than simply extracting tribute from conquered territories, administrators systematically relocated populations to areas where their skills and labor were most needed. Skilled craftsmen were concentrated in workshops where they could contribute to weapons production, while agricultural populations were settled in mountain terraces, where intensive cultivation could support larger urban centers. These population transfers operated according to sophisticated planning that balanced economic considerations with security requirements. Potentially troublesome elements from conquered territories were dispersed among mountain populations unlikely to support resistance movements, while loyal groups received preferential treatment that encouraged collaboration. The result was demographic reshaping that strengthened mountain society while eliminating sources of opposition in newly acquired territories. Rusa IV, the greatest of mountain monarchs, presided over a realm that stretched from the Caucasus Mountains to northern Syria, from Lake Urmia to the approaches of the Euphrates River. His long reign witnessed the completion of building projects that had been generations in the making, while his campaigns established control over territories that commanded some of the ancient world's most important trade routes. The hydraulic achievements of Rusa's era represented the culmination of centuries of mountain expertise in water management. His specialists constructed elaborate canal networks that supported agricultural productivity in elevated regions, while providing reliable water supplies to growing urban centers. The technical sophistication of these projects, precise calculation of gradients, sophisticated understanding of hydraulic principles, and systematic coordination across vast distances demonstrated capabilities that few contemporary powers possessed. Royal inscriptions from Rusa's reign reveal the ideological framework that justified expansion and shaped mountain political culture for generations. The king presented himself not as a conqueror seeking personal glory, but as the earthly representative of Haldi, charged with extending divine order throughout the world. This theological justification for territorial growth would influence political thinking throughout the region long after mountain power had disappeared. The development of cuneiform writing under royal patronage created the first systematic records of mountain culture and provided the foundation necessary for governing extensive territories. Scribes adapted Mesopotamian writing systems to record their own language, while maintaining diplomatic correspondence with foreign courts in Akkadian, the international language of the time. This bilingual capability enabled sophisticated diplomatic relationships while preserving cultural distinctiveness. The royal archives discovered at sites contain thousands of tablets documenting every aspect of governance from provincial management to ceremonies. These records reveal a bureaucratic system of remarkable sophistication, with specialized officials responsible for taxation, recruitment, building projects, and foreign relations. The systematic nature of record keeping enabled coordination across vast distances, while providing detailed information about resources available for future operations. Cultural achievements during the height of power established artistic traditions that would influence mountain culture for centuries. The distinctive style of metalwork produced in royal workshops combined technical mastery with aesthetic sensibilities that created objects of extraordinary beauty and significance. Bronze cauldrons decorated with elaborate animal figures, ceremonial shields bearing complex imagery, and weapons that balanced functional effectiveness with artistic expression all testified to cultural sophistication that rivaled any contemporary power. Sacred building reached its greatest development during this period through temple complexes that integrated mountain traditions with influences absorbed from contact with neighboring cultures. The Temple of Haldi at Musasir, described in Assyrian sources as one of the ancient world's most magnificent sacred buildings, featured elements that combined functional requirements with symbolic representations of divine power. The systematic destruction of this temple by Assyrian forces in 714 BC was intended not merely to eliminate a target, but to demonstrate the powerlessness of mountain gods against Mesopotamian might. The forces that enabled expansion represented a synthesis of mountain traditions, with innovations developed through contact with more advanced neighbors. Mountain warriors retained their traditional emphasis on mobility and knowledge of local terrain, while adopting new weapons and tactical approaches that enabled effective operations in diverse environments. The integration of different combat specialties, heavy infantry for assault operations, mobile cavalry for reconnaissance and pursuit, skilled archers for siege warfare, created combined arms capabilities that few ancient armies possessed. Stronghold building reached unprecedented levels of sophistication as specialists applied centuries of mountain experience to the challenges of defending extended frontiers. The great citadel of Khamir Blur, constructed during the late period, featured defensive innovations that would influence building throughout the region for generations. Its massive walls, equipped with sophisticated gate systems and integrated storage facilities, could withstand the most determined assault while providing secure bases for offensive operations against enemy territories. Yet even as mountain culture reached its zenith, fundamental challenges were emerging that would test the realm's capacity for continued growth. The Assyrian Empire, having consolidated its control over Mesopotamia, began directing increasing attention toward the mountain regions that had previously remained beyond their reach. The advantages that had enabled success were gradually being matched or exceeded by enemies, with far greater resources and more extensive experience in large-scale warfare. The Assyrian war machine that emerged during the 8th century BC possessed capabilities specifically designed to overcome the advantages that mountain peoples had traditionally enjoyed. Professional armies trained for extended campaigns could maintain pressure against mountain strongholds for months or years, while sophisticated siege equipment could breach defensive works that had previously been considered impregnable. More importantly, Assyrian systems could sustain operations across vast distances without the logistical constraints that had limited earlier Mesopotamian expansion into mountain regions. The climactic confrontation came during the reign of Sargon II of Assyria, whose systematic campaign in 714 BC demonstrated the overwhelming advantages that professional armies enjoyed over traditional mountain forces. The Assyrian advanced through the Armenian mountains, methodically reducing strongholds and devastating agricultural areas, revealed how completely the balance had shifted. When Assyrian troops stormed the sacred city of Musasir and carried away the treasures of Haldi's temple, they were demonstrating that mountain gods could not protect their people against enemies who possessed superior organization and resources. The psychological impact of this campaign extended far beyond its immediate consequences. The systematic destruction of sacred centers that had been venerated for generations, the deportation of skilled craftsmen who had maintained cultural traditions, and the imposition of tribute obligations that drained resources needed for defensive preparations, all combined to undermine the foundations of mountain resistance. Local elites who had previously supported authority began calculating whether continued opposition served their interests or merely invited further destruction. Economic pressures generated by prolonged warfare with Assyria gradually undermined the fiscal foundations that had sustained expansion. The tribute payments demanded by Assyrian overlords consumed resources that had previously funded building projects and preparations, while the disruption of trade routes reduced commercial revenues that had supported urban centers. Agricultural productivity declined as mountain terraces became battlefields, forcing dependence on food supplies that were increasingly difficult to obtain. Cultural changes accompanying political decline reflected the broader transformation of mountain society under external pressure. Traditional artistic styles began incorporating Assyrian elements as local craftsmen adapted their work to satisfy foreign tastes and requirements. Practices evolved to accommodate theological concepts that had been unknown during the period of independence. Most significantly, the language itself began absorbing vocabulary and grammatical structures from languages spoken by new populations settling in mountain territories. The gradual disappearance of political control during the 7th century BC marked the end of the first great mountain empire, but not the elimination of mountain culture. The techniques, capabilities, and traditions developed during centuries of rule provided foundations that would support future political developments in the region. The irrigation systems that had enabled agricultural prosperity continued functioning long after their builders had been forgotten, while strongholds constructed by specialists remained positions that influenced operations for generations. Population movements during the final century of power brought new peoples into mountain territories where they encountered established traditions and technological capabilities. These new arrivals, who would eventually become known as Armenians, inherited not only the physical infrastructure created by their predecessors, but also the cultural and intellectual achievements that had distinguished mountain culture. The synthesis of established traditions with new cultural elements would eventually produce an Armenian identity that combined respect for ancient achievements with adaptability to changing circumstances. The transformation from one identity to another occurred gradually through processes that modern scholars can observe but not fully reconstruct. Linguistic evidence suggests that Armenian-speaking peoples gradually replaced earlier populations through migration, intermarriage, and cultural assimilation, rather than through sudden conquest or demographic replacement. Remains indicate continuity in settlement patterns, agricultural techniques, and craft production that argue for peaceful transition rather than violent disruption. Developments during this transition period reveal similar patterns of synthesis rather than replacement. Armenian traditions incorporated elements from earlier theological systems while adapting to new cultural influences from neighboring powers. Sacred sites that had been important during the earlier period continued receiving veneration under Armenian rule, though the specific practices associated with them evolved to reflect changing cultural priorities and external influences. By 600 BC, the mountain regions around Lake Van had been transformed from the center of an independent realm into a contested frontier where multiple powers competed for influence. The Assyrian Empire, which had seemed destined for eternal dominance just decades earlier, was itself struggling to maintain control over territories that exceeded its capabilities. New powers, the Babylonians, the Medes, and the emerging Persian Empire, were beginning to challenge Assyrian control while developing their own claims to mountain territories. The Armenian peoples who inherited this position possessed advantages that their predecessors had developed, but also faced challenges that would test every capability they had acquired. The expertise that enabled effective stronghold building, the metallurgical knowledge that produced superior weapons and tools, and the agricultural techniques that supported mountain prosperity all remained available to support new political ventures. Yet the independence that had enabled earlier expansion was gone, replaced by complex relationships with foreign powers that required diplomatic skills and flexibility that would define Armenian political culture for centuries to come. The stage was set for the emergence of Armenian culture as a distinctive synthesis of inherited achievements and adaptive innovations. The mountain realm that had produced one of the ancient world's most formidable states would soon become the homeland of a people whose survival strategies and cultural accomplishments would enable them to maintain their identity through centuries of foreign domination. The transition from power to endurance marked not the end of mountain greatness, but its transformation into new forms that would prove even more durable than the strength that had established the region's importance. The collapse came swiftly. As the 7th century BC drew to its close, the mountain realm that had challenged Assyria found itself caught in a maelstrom of competition that would reshape the entire ancient world. The Assyrian Empire, weakened by decades of overextension and internal strife, crumbled before the combined assault of Babylonian and Median forces. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC, the geopolitical foundations that had defined the Near East for 3 centuries vanished overnight, leaving power vacuums that ambitious new rulers would rush to fill. Into this chaos stepped Cyrus the Great, a visionary monarch whose conquests would create the largest empire the world had yet witnessed. His armies shattered Median resistance and absorbed their territories within a decade. Lydian resistance crumbled next, bringing control to the Aegean shores. Babylon surrendered without siege, extending dominion from the Indus River to the Mediterranean Sea. The Armenian mountains, with their strategic passes and metalworking expertise, could not long remain independent in this transformed landscape. The absorption of Armenian territories proceeded not through dramatic conquest, but through the inexorable logic of expansion. Mountain rulers, recognizing the futility of resistance against forces that had overwhelmed far greater powers, chose accommodation over destruction. The transition from independence to subordination occurred gradually, as officials established oversight mechanisms, while allowing traditional elites to maintain positions under the new structure. Armenia became a satrapy within the vast administrative system, designated as the 13th province in the empire's formal organization. This incorporation brought immediate changes to relationships that had governed the region for centuries. Rulers who had previously exercised sovereign authority now served as provincial governors answerable to the crown. Tribute obligations replaced internal taxation systems that had funded projects, redirecting wealth toward Persepolis and other centers. Yet this new dominion proved remarkably different from the harsh control that Assyrian overlords had imposed. Where Assyrian policy had emphasized systematic destruction of customs and forced population transfers, the new approach pursued integration strategies that preserved useful institutions while securing interests. This reflected sophisticated understanding of governance developed through managing diverse populations across continental distances. The tribute system operated according to principles that balanced revenue requirements with provincial capacity to pay. The Armenian satrapy was assessed obligations calculated according to systematic surveys of agricultural productivity, population, and commercial activity. These assessments, recorded in documents, reveal a region capable of providing substantial annual payments, 400 talents of silver, representing enormous wealth extracted from mountain mines and commercial activities. The obligations extended beyond simple monetary payments to include specialized products that reflected capabilities and needs. Mountain metalworkers were required to produce weapons and tools for forces, while upland pastures provided horses that became integral components of cavalry units. The region's position along trade routes generated commercial taxes that supplemented direct tribute, creating revenue streams that made the Armenian satrapy one of the empire's most valuable provinces. Structures imposed by officials created the first systematic bureaucracy in Armenian history. Provincial governance required record-keeping capabilities, communication networks, and coordination mechanisms far more sophisticated than anything traditional mountain societies had developed. Standardized procedures for taxation, legal disputes, recruitment, and public works would influence governmental practice in the region for centuries. The road system transformed communication and transportation throughout Armenian territories. The Royal Road, which connected Sardis to Susa across the empire's heartland, passed through Armenian territories and required extensive infrastructure projects. Way stations positioned at regular intervals provided fresh horses and supplies for official messengers, while standardized bridges and maintained routes enabled rapid movement of personnel and information across previously difficult terrain. Greek mercenary Xenophon's account of his army's retreat through Armenian territories provides the only contemporary description of the region under this new dominion. His Anabasis reveals a landscape of prosperous villages, well-defended strongholds, and abundant agricultural production that testified to effective governance. The Greek soldiers encountered rulers who commanded substantial forces and controlled territories organized according to new models, while enjoying considerable autonomy in internal affairs. Xenophon's descriptions of Armenian capabilities reveal how integration had enhanced rather than diminished power. Forces combined traditional mountain warfare techniques with organizational methods and equipment standards. Armenian cavalry, trained according to new methods but adapted to mountain conditions, proved particularly effective against Greek forces unaccustomed to high-altitude warfare. The region's ability to field substantial armies demonstrated that foreign control had strengthened rather than weakened capacity. Transformations accompanying integration reflected the sophisticated approach to governing diverse populations. Zoroastrian practices, while encouraged through official support and temple construction, were not imposed at the expense of customs. Armenian practices evolved to incorporate theological concepts while maintaining distinctive characteristics. This synthesis created frameworks that combined legitimacy with identity. The influence of Zoroastrianism on Armenian thought proved particularly significant for future developments. Theological concepts, especially the emphasis on cosmic struggle between good and evil forces, provided intellectual frameworks that would later facilitate Armenian adoption of Christianity. The practice of venerating fire as a sacred element established ritual customs that influenced Armenian practices for centuries. Language evolution during this period reflected similar patterns of synthesis rather than replacement. Aramaic, the empire's language, became widely used for official business and commercial transactions. However, native languages continued evolving, absorbing vocabulary while maintaining grammatical structures that preserved linguistic heritage. This bilingual capability enabled Armenian participation in activities while preserving distinctiveness. The emergence of the Orontid dynasty around 401 BC marked a crucial shift in Armenian evolution. These rulers, probably descended from noble families granted territorial control, established hereditary authority that would endure for over 2 centuries. Unlike appointed provincial governors who served at pleasure, the Orontids built independent power bases that enabled them to pursue interests while maintaining nominal allegiance. Orontes I, the dynasty's founder, exemplified the complex balance required for successful leadership under oversight. His court maintained ceremonial customs and procedures, while cultivating support through policies that benefited Armenian interests. This dual approach enabled him to function effectively within the system, while building authority that could survive changes in policy or leadership. The Orontid capital at Armavir became a center where traditions merged to create distinctive synthetic forms. Palace architecture incorporated design elements, while adapting to conditions and defensive requirements. Court ceremonies combined protocols with customs, creating frameworks that acknowledge sovereignty while maintaining Armenian identity. Practices synthesized Zoroastrian theological concepts with traditional mountain beliefs, establishing patterns that would influence spiritual evolution for generations. Armenian participation in campaigns demonstrated the region's integration into strategic planning. Armenian forces served in armies that fought against Greek city-states, providing cavalry and infantry units that enhanced capabilities. These campaigns exposed Armenian soldiers to diverse traditions and battlefield techniques, while demonstrating their value as professional warriors capable of operating effectively in various environments. The Battle of Gaugamela saw Armenian cavalry units fighting alongside forces against Alexander the Great's advancing armies. Though the battle ended in decisive defeat, Armenian units distinguished themselves through disciplined performance under extreme pressure. Their ability to maintain formation and execute tactical maneuvers during one of history's most chaotic battles testified to professionalism developed through centuries of service. Engineering projects in Armenian territories created infrastructure that would support development for centuries. Irrigation systems expanded agricultural productivity through techniques that combined hydraulic expertise with knowledge of mountain conditions. Road construction connected previously isolated areas to communication networks, while facilitating commercial growth that increased prosperity. The practice of relocating skilled populations brought new expertise to Armenian territories, while exposing craftsmen to advanced techniques developed elsewhere in the empire. Metal workers from various regions shared knowledge that enhanced capabilities, while textile producers introduced weaving methods that created new commercial opportunities. These exchanges enriched Armenian material culture while maintaining traditional craftsmanship that preserved identity. Commercial expansion under this dominion transformed Armenian economic relationships with neighboring regions. The empire's vast trade networks provided markets for Armenian products, while ensuring reliable supplies of goods that enhanced prosperity. Silver mining in the Armenian mountains expanded to meet currency needs, generating wealth that supported urban growth and population increase throughout the region. Legal systems imposed by officials created standardized frameworks for resolving disputes and regulating commercial relationships. Law codes provided procedural guidelines while allowing customs to govern personal and family matters. This balance between uniformity and autonomy established precedents that would influence Armenian legal evolution long after this period had ended. Educational advances established intellectual foundations that would support future achievements. Support for literacy and learning created schools where young Armenians mastered Aramaic writing while maintaining oral customs that preserved historical memory. These institutions produced personnel capable of managing complex governmental and commercial activities while preserving knowledge essential for identity. Architecture during this period reflected the synthesis that characterized cultural evolution under foreign control. Zoroastrian fire temples constructed according to architectural principles were adapted to conditions while incorporating decorative elements that maintained artistic heritage. These buildings served both spiritual and functions, demonstrating authority while providing focal points for community activities that preserved identity. Economic policies created prosperity that supported population growth and urban expansion throughout Armenian territories. Tax revenues collected through systematic assessment procedures funded public works projects that enhanced infrastructure while contributing to resources. This balance between development and extraction demonstrated sophisticated approaches to provincial governance that maximized long-term productivity rather than pursuing short-term exploitation. Armenian noble families that emerged during this era established social and economic foundations that would influence development for centuries. These elites, educated in methods while maintaining connections to communities, developed capabilities for managing complex relationships between requirements and interests. Their skills and adaptability would prove essential during future periods of transition. Achievements during this period established artistic and intellectual customs that combined sophistication with distinctiveness. Armenian craftsmen working within frameworks created objects that demonstrated technical mastery while maintaining aesthetic qualities that reflected heritage. Literature and oral customs preserved historical memories while adapting to new influences, creating synthetic forms that enriched intellectual life. The approach to governing Armenian territories created precedents that would influence future rulers throughout the region. The balance between central authority and autonomy, the integration of traditional elites into structures, and the preservation of useful institutions while imposing standards all demonstrated governmental techniques that later empires would adopt and adapt. Innovations during this period enhanced Armenian capabilities while maintaining traditional advantages that mountain warfare provided. The integration of cavalry techniques with knowledge of terrain created combined arms capabilities that proved effective in diverse operational environments. Armenian units developed reputations for reliability and effectiveness that would make them valuable allies for future powers. As Alexander's armies swept across the empire, destroying centuries of development in a few short years, Armenian territories faced another fundamental transition. The Urartu rulers, who had learned to navigate structures, would need to develop new strategies for survival in a world dominated by Macedonian ambitions and Hellenistic influences. The skills developed during 2 centuries of foreign control, diplomatic flexibility, competence, and adaptability would prove essential for maintaining autonomy during the chaos that followed Alexander's conquests. This period had transformed Armenian society from a collection of mountain communities into a sophisticated provincial culture capable of participating effectively in systems while maintaining distinctive identity. The governmental techniques, frameworks, and intellectual foundations established during these centuries provided bases that would support Armenian evolution through all future transitions. The lesson learned under foreign dominion, that survival required adaptation without abandonment of essential identity, would guide Armenian responses to external control for millennia to come. The thunderbolt struck at Gaugamela when Alexander's cavalry smashed through Darius III's lines in 331 BC. More than a battle was decided, an entire world order crumbled. The great king fled eastward, abandoning his empire to the Macedonian whirlwind that swept across Asia with unprecedented speed. Within 3 years, Alexander commanded territories from Egypt to India, while the sophisticated administrative systems that had governed the known world for 2 centuries lay in ruins. Armenia found itself orphaned by this catastrophe. The Urartu rulers, who had skillfully navigated between loyalty and autonomy under stable oversight, now faced a power vacuum that invited chaos. Alexander's armies never penetrated deeply into the Armenian highlands, but their indirect impact proved revolutionary. The collapse of centralized authority created opportunities for ambitious leaders, while exposing the region to predatory neighbors who saw weakness where once there had been order. The young conqueror's death at Babylon in 323 BC triggered a succession crisis that would reshape the eastern Mediterranean for generations. His generals, the Diadochi, carved up the vast conquest among themselves through 20 years of warfare that devastated cities and scattered populations across 3 continents. Armenia, positioned between the emerging kingdoms of the Seleucids in Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt, became a prize coveted by multiple claimants who understood its strategic value. Seleucus I Nicator, founder of the Seleucid dynasty, moved quickly to secure Armenian territories that controlled crucial mountain passes linking his Syrian heartland to Central Asian provinces. Rather than imposing direct occupation, Seleucus granted the Orontids vassal status that acknowledged their hereditary rights while securing strategic objectives. The formal treaty, signed at Antioch in 301 BC, established precise terms that would govern relationships for nearly a century. Under these agreements, Orontid rulers retained authority over internal affairs, including taxation, legal disputes, and religious practices. However, they committed to providing 10,000 cavalry troops for Seleucid campaigns and granting passage rights through mountain passes during wartime. Most significantly, the kingdom agreed to annual tribute of 300 talents of silver, substantial wealth that demonstrated both prosperity and subordination. The treaty's commercial clauses proved equally important for long-term relationships. Seleucid merchants received preferential access to mountain markets, while specific routes were designated for royal traffic. These provisions integrated highland economies into broader Mediterranean trade networks, while ensuring that Seleucid interests received priority treatment in all commercial disputes. Marriage alliances formed another crucial component of these diplomatic arrangements. Orontid princes were encouraged to marry into Seleucid noble families, creating kinship networks that reinforced political obligations through personal relationships. These unions produced children educated in both traditions, creating a generation of leaders comfortable navigating between Highland customs and Hellenic court protocols. Even as Highland territories accepted Seleucid suzerainty, profound changes were transforming the region's social landscape. Mediterranean merchants, soldiers, and officials brought ideas and practices that would fundamentally alter Highland society. Urban planning concepts developed in Greek Piraeus influenced the construction of new cities, while Hellenic educational methods created schools where Highland youth mastered Greek language and literature alongside traditional mountain lore. The influence of classical intellectual frameworks proved particularly transformative for elite society. Philosophical concepts emphasizing rational inquiry began supplementing traditional approaches to understanding the world. Mathematical principles developed in Alexandria found practical application in Highland engineering projects, while Mediterranean medical knowledge enhanced traditional healing practices. However, this absorption of foreign influences occurred selectively rather than wholesale. Highland leaders carefully evaluated which innovations would strengthen their society, while rejecting elements that might undermine essential characteristics. Greek democratic concepts were studied but not implemented, as Highland political systems remained fundamentally monarchical. Greek individualism, which emphasized personal achievement over family loyalty, conflicted with Highland values that prioritized clan relationships and collective responsibility. Religious syncretism followed similar patterns of selective adaptation. Traditional Highland deities retained their central positions in popular worship, but their theological significance was increasingly interpreted through philosophical frameworks derived from classical thought. Zeus was identified with the ancient sky god Aramazd, while Aphrodite merged with the Highland goddess of fertility and abundance. These identifications enabled participation in Mediterranean religious networks while preserving spiritual practices that maintained cultural distinctiveness. Economic relationships underwent dramatic transformation. as highland territories became integrated into vast commercial networks, linking Hellenic kingdoms across the eastern Mediterranean. Mountain silver that had once flowed to Persepolis now found markets in Antioch and Alexandria, while Greek manufactured goods reached highland cities through trade routes that connected previously isolated communities to cosmopolitan commercial centers. The expansion of mining operations demonstrated how foreign investment could enhance traditional industries while maintaining local control. Seleucid merchants provided capital and technical expertise for expanding silver extraction, but highland families retained ownership of the most productive sites. New extraction techniques increased output dramatically, while creating employment opportunities that stimulated urban growth throughout the region. Agricultural innovations combined classical scientific knowledge with traditional highland farming methods to increase productivity on mountain terraces, where every acre represented precious resources. Improved ploughing techniques enabled more intensive cultivation, while systematic crop rotation preserved soil fertility. Selective breeding of livestock produced animals better adapted to highland conditions, while providing meat, dairy products, and wool for both subsistence and commercial purposes. The development of highland coinage provides remarkable insights into how the kingdom balanced assertions of independence with acknowledgement of connections to the broader Mediterranean world. Early coins featured classical inscriptions and imagery that proclaimed participation in international civilization, but artistic elements gradually incorporated highland symbols that emphasized regional distinctiveness. The emergence of the Artaxia dynasty around 190 BC marked a watershed moment in Armenian political evolution. Artaxias I, the dynasty's founder, exploited the weakening of Seleucid authority following their defeat by Rome at the Battle of Magnesia to assert independence that would endure for over a century. His declaration of autonomy represented more than simple opportunism. It reflected sophisticated understanding of changing international relationships that created space for middle powers to pursue independent policies. Rather than simply repudiating previous obligations, Artaxias negotiated an agreement that recognized Armenian independence while maintaining commercial and cultural connections to the Hellenic world. This diplomatic framework enabled Armenia to function as a sovereign state while avoiding the isolation that had weakened other mountain kingdoms. Artaxias demonstrated his commitment to independence through the ambitious project of constructing a new capital that would embody Armenian aspirations for permanent sovereignty. The city of Artashat, built on the Arax River according to plans that synthesized Greek urban design principles with Armenian defensive requirements, represented more than administrative convenience. It symbolized the emergence of a distinctively Armenian political identity. The city's location at the confluence of the Arax and Metsamor rivers provided access to fertile agricultural land while offering defensive advantages that could withstand siege warfare. The street layout followed classical grid patterns modified to accommodate highland social customs that emphasized extended family relationships and community gatherings. Main avenues ran east-west to capture maximum sunlight during harsh mountain winters, while secondary streets created neighborhoods where related families could build adjacent compounds. Water management represented one of the project's greatest engineering challenges. Teams of specialists diverted mountain streams to create a sophisticated hydraulic system that provided fresh water to every district while powering mills that processed grain for the growing population. Stone-lined channels carried water through underground passages that protected the supply from both winter freezing and enemy interference during sieges. The royal palace complex occupied the city's highest point, its walls rising directly from natural rock formations that made assault virtually impossible. Within these fortifications, Artaxias created living spaces that reflected his dual identity, as Highland warrior and Hellenistic monarch. Reception halls featured classical columns supporting ceilings decorated with frescoes that depicted both Mediterranean mythological scenes and episodes from Highland historical memory. Religious architecture throughout the city reflected similar patterns of adaptation and synthesis. The main temple complex honored both traditional Highland deities and Hellenic gods, whose worship had been introduced through diplomatic contacts and commercial relationships. The temple of Ahura Mazda featured fire altars, maintained according to Zoroastrian ritual requirements, while adjacent buildings housed Greek-style statuary that depicted familiar gods in forms that reflected local artistic sensibilities. The royal palace complex at Artashat became a center for cultural synthesis that would influence Armenian civilization for centuries. Greek artists working alongside Armenian craftsmen created decorative programs that celebrated both classical mythology and mountain historical traditions. Libraries collected works in Greek, Aramaic, and emerging Armenian literary languages, while schools provided education that prepared young Armenians for participation in the broader Hellenic world without abandoning their distinctive cultural heritage. The Royal Library became one of the ancient world's most remarkable institutions, collecting works in multiple languages while supporting scholarly activities that advanced human knowledge. Scribes working under royal patronage copied classical texts while composing original works that recorded Highland historical memory and contemporary achievements. Educational institutions associated with the library provided instruction that prepared young people for participation in the broader Mediterranean world while maintaining connections to Highland heritage. The influence of Greek dramatic traditions led to the construction of theatres in Armenian cities, where classical plays were performed alongside works that celebrated Armenian historical achievements. These cultural institutions served multiple purposes. They provided entertainment that demonstrated Armenian participation in Hellenic civilization. They created venues for political discourse that strengthened civic engagement, and they preserved oral traditions through dramatic presentations that made historical events accessible to illiterate populations. Military developments during the Artaxiad period demonstrated similar patterns of selective adaptation rather than wholesale adoption of foreign practices. Highland cavalry units trained according to classical tactical manuals while maintaining traditional advantages in mountain warfare that had distinguished Highland forces for centuries. Infantry formations adopted Mediterranean weapons and armor, while preserving knowledge of terrain and weather conditions that proved crucial for operations in Highland territories. The royal court at Artashat became a center for diplomatic activity that connected the Highland kingdom to political developments throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Ambassadors from various kingdoms, Parthian territories, and emerging Roman power all sought Highland alliance or neutrality in their various conflicts. These relationships required sophisticated understanding of international law and custom that Highland officials developed through careful study of classical theory and practical experience in negotiations. Marriage diplomacy played a crucial role in these international relationships. Royal daughters were married to princes from neighboring kingdoms, creating kinship networks that reinforced political alliances through personal bonds. These unions required careful negotiation of dowry arrangements, succession rights, and religious obligations that respected both Highland customs and foreign expectations. The reign of Artavasdes II marked both the culmination of Artaxiad cultural achievement and the beginning of political pressures that would ultimately overwhelm Armenian independence. His court attracted scholars, artists, and poets from throughout the Hellenic world who found in Armenia a synthesis of cultural traditions that offered alternatives to the increasingly standardized civilization emerging in other kingdoms. Roman expansion into eastern territories brought a new type of imperial power into contact with Armenian independence. Unlike previous conquerors who had sought to extract tribute while allowing substantial local autonomy, Roman objectives included systematic transformation of conquered territories, according to principles that left little space for the cultural synthesis that had characterized Armenian development. Parthian resurgence under the Arsacid dynasty created an eastern counterweight to Roman pressure that offered opportunities for Armenian maneuvering while imposing additional constraints on political freedom. The emergence of this Iranian empire meant that Armenia once again found itself positioned between competing great powers whose conflicts would be fought partly on Armenian soil, while their cooperation would be negotiated partly through Armenian diplomatic mediation. The cultural legacy of the Artaxiad period provided foundations that would enable Armenian civilization to survive the loss of political independence while maintaining essential characteristics that distinguished it from neighboring cultures. The synthesis of Greek intellectual traditions with Armenian historical memory, the development of urban institutions that combined Hellenic civic principles with mountain social structures, and the creation of artistic traditions that expressed universal human themes through distinctively Armenian symbolic languages, all contributed to cultural resilience that would prove more durable than any political institution. As the 2nd century BC drew to its close, Armenia stood at a crossroads that would determine its future relationship to the great powers that were reshaping the ancient world. The achievements of Artaxiad rulers had demonstrated that middle powers could maintain independence and cultural distinctiveness within the Hellenistic state system, but the emergence of Roman and Parthian empires was creating new pressures that would require different strategies for survival. The lessons learned during 2 centuries of Hellenic influence, that cultural adaptation could strengthen rather than weaken essential identity, that diplomatic flexibility was essential for political survival, and that internal development provided the foundation for external independence, would guide Armenian responses to the challenges ahead. The stage was set for the emergence of a ruler whose ambitions would transform Armenia from a successful regional kingdom into a major power capable of challenging the greatest empires of the ancient world. The infrastructure created by Artaxiad policy, the cultural synthesis achieved through Hellenic influence, and the diplomatic experience gained through relationships with multiple powers had prepared Armenia for leadership that would surpass anything its previous history had achieved. The greatest chapter of ancient Armenian history was about to begin. A hostage returned home transformed. For 18 years, Tigranes had lived in the Parthian court at Ctesiphon, observing how the Arsacid dynasty governed territories stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus River. He studied their administrative methods, absorbed their strategic thinking, and learned to navigate complex relationships that held together the Parthian realm. When Mithridates II finally released him to claim the throne in 95 BC, Tigranes brought back more than diplomatic experience. He possessed a vision that would transform his mountain kingdom into the greatest power the ancient world had seen since Alexander. His accession reflected diplomatic sophistication that would characterize his entire reign. Rather than simply purchasing freedom, Tigranes negotiated a comprehensive agreement that secured Parthian recognition of his sovereignty while establishing frameworks for future cooperation. Treaties required him to cede 70 valleys in the Artsakh region to Parthian control, but guaranteed non-interference in his western plans while providing access to Parthian expertise and commercial networks. This early success demonstrated capabilities that would enable achievements far exceeding anything his predecessors had accomplished. previous rulers had focused primarily on maintaining independence through careful balancing between competing powers. But Tigranes understood that survival in the changing international environment required active growth that could secure resources and strategic positions necessary for long-term security. Internal reforms implemented during his first decade revealed sophisticated understanding of how growth required institutional foundations capable of governing diverse populations across vast distances. Royal bureaucracy was restructured according to principles that combined traditional mountain governmental methods with innovations observed during his Parthian captivity. Provincial management was standardized to ensure consistent policy implementation, while communication networks were expanded to enable coordination across domains that would soon stretch from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean. Military reorganization proved equally comprehensive and forward-thinking. Forces inherited from his predecessors, though effective for defensive operations and limited campaigns, lacked capabilities necessary for sustained offensive operations across continental distances. Tigranes systematically transformed these traditional units into professional armies capable of prolonged campaigns, while maintaining superiority in mountain terrain that remained the kingdom's ultimate defensive foundation. Integration of Parthian techniques with traditional mountain warfare methods created combined arms capabilities that would prove devastatingly effective against enemies throughout the region. Heavy cavalry, trained according to Parthian methods, provided shock combat effectiveness for open field battles, while traditional mountain infantry retained advantages in siege warfare and mountain operations. Most importantly, creation of specialized engineer units enabled systematic reduction of fortified positions that had previously been considered impregnable. Development of siege warfare capabilities represented perhaps Tigranes' most significant innovation. Teams of craftsmen working under royal patronage designed assault equipment that incorporated latest technological advances while adapting to operational requirements imposed by mountain logistics and diverse geographical conditions. These innovations would enable systematic conquest of strongholds throughout Syria and Mesopotamia that had withstood previous assault attempts by various powers. First major operations began around 88 BC with campaigns that demonstrated how completely mountain capabilities had been transformed. Sophene, which controlled strategic regions between the main mountain realm and Mesopotamian trade routes, fell after a brief campaign that revealed both effectiveness of reformed armies and strategic vision-guiding plans. Rather than simply annexing conquered regions, Tigranes implemented policies designed to integrate new populations while preserving their productive capacity. Population transfer programs initiated during these early campaigns reflected sophisticated understanding of how demographic engineering could strengthen central authority while eliminating sources of future resistance. Skilled craftsmen and educated bureaucrats from conquered regions were relocated to mountain centers where their expertise could enhance economic development, while potential troublemakers were dispersed among communities unlikely to support rebellion. These policies created ethnically mixed populations throughout the expanding realm that had no traditional basis for coordinated opposition. Systematic operations into Cappadocia during the 80s BC brought mountain armies into direct confrontation with Roman interests for the first time. Complex political situations in this region, where multiple claimants competed for authority while seeking support from various external powers, provided opportunities for intervention that could advance objectives while avoiding direct conflict with Rome. Tigranes' ability to navigate these complexities while achieving gains demonstrated diplomatic skills that complemented his growing strength. Alliance with Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus, proved crucial for enabling operations on the scale that Tigranes envisioned. This partnership, formalized through marriage between Tigranes and Mithridates' daughter Cleopatra, created cooperation that combined Pontic naval capabilities with mountain resources. Coordination of their campaigns against Roman interests required sophisticated strategic planning that took into account operations across multiple theaters while maintaining initiative against enemies with superior overall resources. Great Syrian campaigns of the 80s and 70s, Bayi, mark the zenith of mountain achievement and demonstrated how effectively reformed institutions could project power across continental distances. Systematic reduction of Seleucid domains proceeded through carefully planned operations that combined pressure with diplomatic inducements designed to encourage submission rather than desperate resistance. City after city opened its gates to mountain armies that offered prosperity and autonomy under enlightened oversight rather than exploitation they had experienced under weakening Seleucid rule. Damascus, the ancient commercial center that controlled crucial trade routes between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean, surrendered after a siege that showcased mountain engineering capabilities while demonstrating futility of resistance against such determined and well-equipped armies. Treatment of the conquered city revealed sophisticated approaches to integration that distinguished mountain policy from earlier ventures. Rather than destroying existing institutions, Tigranes preserved commercial networks and bureaucratic structures while incorporating them into frameworks that served his interests. Conquest of Antioch in 83 BC represented perhaps the greatest single achievement of mountain operations. This magnificent city, founded by Seleucus I and developed over 2.5 centuries into one of the ancient world's greatest urban centers, possessed wealth and sophistication that rivaled Alexandria and Rome. Its fall to mountain armies demonstrated that no city, regardless of its previous history or defensive capabilities, could withstand assault by properly equipped and professionally led troops. Policies implemented in conquered Syrian regions revealed how Tigranes had learned from observing Parthian governmental methods while adapting them to mountain requirements and local conditions. Rather than imposing uniform approaches regardless of regional differences, mountain bureaucrats developed flexible methods that preserved useful local institutions while ensuring loyalty to central authority. Tax structures were calibrated to encourage economic development rather than simply extracting maximum immediate revenues, while legal frameworks combined mountain principles with local customs in ways that satisfied both royal requirements and popular expectations. Establishing a new capital demonstrated ambitions that extended far beyond simple acquisition. Tigranocerta, founded around 77 BC in the fertile valley between the Tigris and its tributaries, was designed from the beginning as the center of a universal empire that would eventually encompass the entire eastern Mediterranean. Location provided strategic access to both Mesopotamian and Mediterranean regions, while offering defensive advantages that could protect the royal court during periods of external pressure. Construction of Tigranocerta required organizational capabilities that rivaled the greatest projects of the ancient world. Thousands of workers, drawn from domains throughout the expanding empire, labored for over a decade to create urban infrastructure that could accommodate governmental, commercial, and intellectual activities necessary for royal oversight. Scale of this undertaking demonstrated both wealth generated by growth and confidence that mountain leadership felt regarding permanence of their achievements. City design reflected sophisticated urban planning that incorporated lessons learned from observing the greatest centers of the contemporary world. Wide avenues enabled efficient movement of people and goods, while providing impressive approaches to monumental buildings that proclaimed royal authority. Public spaces were positioned to accommodate large gatherings while serving functions that required coordination between various governmental departments. Most importantly, the royal palace complex was designed to house diplomatic and ceremonial activities necessary for governing domains that stretched across multiple regions. Programs initiated at Tigranokerta demonstrated how mountain leadership understood that lasting authority required more than conquest. Royal libraries collected works from every major intellectual tradition within the empire while supporting scholarly activities that advanced human knowledge. Greek philosophers, Mesopotamian astronomers, and mountain historians all worked under royal patronage to create synthetic intellectual approaches that reflected the cosmopolitan character of society. Theatrical productions staged in the city's magnificent theatre brought together artistic approaches from throughout the empire while celebrating mountain achievements that had enabled such synthesis. Greek dramas were performed alongside works that commemorated mountain historical achievements, while musical approaches from various regions were combined to create new forms of entertainment that reflected diversity while maintaining mountain leadership. Economic policies that sustained operations revealed sophisticated understanding of how growth could be made financially sustainable, rather than dependent on constant warfare for funding. Commercial networks linking domains throughout the empire created trade relationships that generated substantial revenues, while encouraging economic development that strengthened foundations. Rather than simply extracting tribute from conquered regions, mountain bureaucrats implemented policies designed to increase overall productivity that could support both local prosperity and royal requirements. Silver mining operations in mountain regions expanded dramatically during this period, as demands required currency production on unprecedented scales. New extraction techniques enabled increased output while maintaining quality standards necessary for international commerce. Royal mints at Tigranokerta produced coins that circulated throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while proclaiming sovereignty through imagery that combined traditional symbols with artistic elements drawn from various traditions within the empire. Agricultural development throughout domains demonstrated how mountain policies could enhance rather than exploit local productive capacity. Irrigation networks were expanded using techniques that combined mountain hydraulic expertise with methods developed in various regions of the empire. Crop diversification programs introduced new farming techniques while preserving traditional methods that were adapted to local conditions. Results included increased food production that supported population growth while generating surpluses that could be traded for manufactured goods and luxury items. Diplomatic relationships maintained with powers beyond boundaries revealed how mountain leadership understood that successful operations required careful management of external relationships as well as internal development. Treaties with Parthia ensured continued cooperation while defining spheres of influence that prevented conflicts over boundaries. Relationships with various Germanic and Thracian peoples provided access to recruitment while creating buffer zones that protected domains from raids by nomadic confederations. Most complex diplomatic challenges involved managing relationships with Rome, as mountain operations brought the two powers into increasingly direct competition. Initial Roman response to mountain growth had been relatively restrained, as Roman attention was focused primarily on internal political conflicts and campaigns against other enemies. However, systematic conquest of regions that Rome considered within its sphere of influence made confrontation increasingly inevitable. Despite diplomatic efforts to maintain peaceful coexistence, mountain approaches to this developing crisis demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how middle powers could successfully challenge dominant empires through strategic coordination with other threatened states. Alliance with Mithridates VI provided access to naval capabilities that mountain domains lacked, while enabling coordination of operations across multiple theaters that could divide Roman attention and resources. Additional diplomatic efforts sought to create broader coalitions that might include Celtic tribes in Gaul, Germanic confederations along the Rhine frontier, and various eastern peoples who had reasons to oppose Roman growth. Preparations for anticipated conflict with Rome revealed how mountain capabilities had evolved to meet challenges that would have been unthinkable for previous generations. Professional armies created during the period possessed training, equipment, and organizational structure that enabled effective operations against the best troops of the contemporary world. Technical expertise developed through systematic siege warfare could be applied to defensive operations that would make mountain domains extremely costly for enemies to conquer. Fortification programs implemented throughout domains created defensive networks that could channel enemy advances through predetermined routes, while providing secure bases for counteroffensive operations. Mountain passes were strengthened through construction projects that combined natural defensive advantages with artificial obstacles designed to maximize effectiveness of defenders, while minimizing advantages that superior numbers might provide to attacking armies. Yet even as mountain power reached its greatest extent and capability, underlying tensions were developing that would ultimately challenge sustainability of operations. Vast distances involved in governing domains from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean strained communication networks beyond their effective capacity, while differences between various populations created integration challenges that no governmental approach had yet successfully resolved on such a scale. Economic pressures generated by maintaining large armies across continental distances began consuming resources faster than growth could generate new revenues. Costs of garrisoning Syria, Mesopotamia, and Cappadocia simultaneously represented permanent commitments that limited flexibility for responding to new threats or opportunities. Moreover, wealth required to maintain court life at Tigranocerta, support programs, and fund construction projects created fiscal obligations that could be sustained only through continued successful operations. Roman response to mountain operations proved more systematic and determined than mountain leadership had anticipated. Lucullus, appointed to command Roman armies in the east, possessed both capabilities and strategic understanding that enabled effective operations against mountain positions that had previously been considered secure. His systematic approach to siege warfare neutralized many of the defensive advantages that mountain armies had traditionally enjoyed, while his ability to coordinate operations across multiple theaters prevented mountain commanders from concentrating their strength effectively. Siege of Tigranocerta in 69 BC tested every capability that mountain civilization had developed over the previous decades. Defensive works, considered among the strongest in the ancient world, faced assault techniques that represented the culmination of Roman expertise. Battle that determined the city's fate would decide not only the immediate campaign, but the future of mountain aspirations for dominance. As mountain armies prepared to defend their greatest achievement against Roman assault, they faced challenges that would test every lesson learned during decades of operations and every capability developed through synthesis and innovation. Outcome would determine whether the mountain experiment in universal empire could survive contact with Roman determination to dominate the eastern Mediterranean, or whether mountain ambitions would join the ruins of previous ventures that had challenged Roman authority and failed. Blood stained the marble floors of Tigranocerta as Roman legionaries stormed through the palace gates. Lucullus had achieved what many thought impossible: the systematic reduction of the most formidable fortress in the Eastern world. Yet even as flames consumed the libraries, where scholars had labored to synthesize the wisdom of 3 continents, something crucial survived the destruction. The great king himself escaped with a core of loyal followers, carrying with him not just the remnants of his armies, but the bitter knowledge that his mountain kingdom could never again stand alone against the great powers that now divided the world between them. Tigranokerta's fall in 69 BC marked more than a battlefield defeat. It signaled the end of Armenia's brief experiment as an independent power. When the humbled monarch finally submitted to Pompey 3 years later, accepting the status of Roman client while retaining control over his ancestral domains, he established a pattern that would define Armenian politics for the next 3 centuries. Never again would the mountain kingdom command regions beyond its ethnic boundaries, but neither would it disappear entirely into foreign empires. Instead, Armenia would become something new in the ancient world, a permanent buffer state whose survival depended on playing competing powers against each other. Pompey's settlement revealed sophisticated Roman understanding of Eastern politics that went far beyond simple conquest. Rather than attempting to govern the Armenian highlands directly, which would have required permanent garrisons and enormous costs, he transformed the fallen king into a valuable ally whose local knowledge and established authority could serve Roman interests more effectively than any appointed governor. This arrangement preserved Armenian autonomy within carefully defined limits, while ensuring that mountain passes remained open to Roman commerce and closed to Roman enemies. Mark Antony's eastern ambitions would test this delicate balance to its breaking point. When civil war erupted between him and Octavian, Antony desperately needed allies who could provide the resources and manpower necessary for his struggle against the future Augustus. Armenia, with its strategic position, mineral wealth, and experienced warriors, became a crucial component of his plans for Eastern Empire. Yet his demands would prove so excessive that they ultimately drove even his Armenian allies into opposition. Artavasdes II, son and successor of the great conqueror, found himself caught between impossible choices. Antony demanded not just political support, but active participation in his planned invasion of Parthia, a venture that would have required Armenian troops to fight against their eastern neighbors while leaving their homeland vulnerable to Parthian retaliation. When Artavasdes hesitated to commit his soldiers to such a risky enterprise, Antony's response revealed the brutal realities of being Rome's client rather than its equal partner. Antony's invasion of Armenia demonstrated how quickly protective relationships could transform into predatory ones when Roman leaders needed scapegoats for their failures. Artavasdes was captured through treachery during what he believed were peace negotiations, then transported to Alexandria, where he was displayed in golden chains during Antony's triumph. This public humiliation of a king who had honored previous agreements sent shockwaves throughout the eastern kingdoms and established precedents that would haunt Roman-Armenian relations for generations. Yet even as one dynasty fell, another rose to take its place. Artaxius II, installed by Parthian armies, embodied the new reality of Armenian politics. Rulers who owed their thrones to foreign intervention, but who nevertheless maintained genuine connections to their subjects and their homeland's interests. His reign demonstrated how Armenian leaders could navigate between competing empires while preserving essential elements of their identity and political autonomy. Early policies pursued by Artaxius II reflected hard-won wisdom about survival in a world dominated by competition between great powers. Rather than attempting to play Rome and Parthia against each other through deception or betrayal, he pursued transparent diplomacy that acknowledged his dependencies while maximizing his freedom of action. This approach required constant recalibration as the balance of power shifted, but it enabled Armenia to avoid the catastrophic conflicts that destroyed other client kingdoms during this period. Religious developments during this transitional era revealed how external pressures could paradoxically strengthen internal cohesion. As Armenian nobles were forced to choose between Roman and Parthian patrons, many found unity in shared spiritual practices that transcended political divisions. Zoroastrian influences, strengthened through Parthian connections, began merging with traditional Armenian beliefs and Greek philosophical concepts to create synthetic religious frameworks that would later facilitate the kingdom's conversion to Christianity. Temple construction programs initiated during this period reflected these evolving spiritual syntheses. Sacred complexes built under Artaxius II combined architectural elements drawn from multiple traditions while maintaining distinctively Armenian characteristics. Fire altars served Zoroastrian ceremonies, while adjacent spaces housed traditional Armenian religious practices, creating sacred environments that accommodated diverse spiritual needs within unified frameworks. Augustus's approach to Armenian affairs demonstrated how successful management required flexibility rather than rigid adherence to predetermined policies. When Artaxius II's pro-Parthian orientation threatened Roman interests, Augustus could have responded with massive intervention. Instead, he chose subtler methods that achieved his objectives, while avoiding the costs and risks associated with direct conquest. Installing Tigranes III as a Roman client represented sophisticated understanding of how legitimacy could be more effective than force. Brief reign of Tigranes III illustrated both the possibilities and limitations of Roman client kingship. His genuine Armenian ancestry provided legitimacy that foreign governors could never possess, while his Roman education enabled him to navigate bureaucracy with skills that purely local leaders often lacked. Yet his dependence on Roman support made him vulnerable to accusations of being a puppet ruler, while his attempts to assert independence risked provoking the intervention that had brought him to power. Strabo's geographical descriptions, written during this period, provide invaluable insights into how Armenia appeared to outside observers during this era of transition. His accounts reveal a kingdom that had retained its essential character despite decades of foreign intervention. Urban centers continued functioning. According to traditional patterns, agricultural regions remained productive, and local customs persisted even as political authority shifted between competing claimants backed by different foreign powers. These observations suggest that ordinary Armenians had developed strategies for maintaining their daily lives, regardless of which dynasty occupied the throne or which empire claimed suzerainty. Rural communities continued their agricultural cycles, urban craftsmen maintained their workshops, and merchants pursued commercial opportunities that transcended political boundaries. This resilience would prove crucial for survival during the centuries of instability that lay ahead. Vonones' Urkis accession marked a new phase in Roman-Armenian relations that would establish patterns lasting for generations. Unlike previous rulers who had been chosen primarily for their prowess or dynastic connections, Vonones represented a deliberate Roman experiment in engineering. Educated entirely within the Roman system and thoroughly versed in methods, he was intended to create a new model for client kingship that would be more responsive to Roman interests while maintaining sufficient Armenian character to ensure popular acceptance. His reign as ultimate failure provided crucial lessons about the limits of manipulation in political relationships. Despite his genuine Armenian ancestry and his careful attention to local customs, Vonones never escaped suspicions that he served Roman rather than Armenian interests. When Parthian pressure forced him to flee his kingdom, his departure was celebrated by many Armenians who preferred uncertain independence to certain subordination. Artabanus III's intervention in Armenian affairs demonstrated how Parthian policy had evolved to match Roman sophistication in managing client relationships, rather than simply installing puppet rulers who would inevitably be overthrown when circumstances changed. Parthian leaders began cultivating Armenian nobles who could provide effective governance while maintaining loyalty to Eastern interests. This approach recognized that successful client relationships required mutual benefit rather than simple subordination. Zeno-Artaxius, installed as Artaxius III by Parthian armies, exemplified this new approach to client kingship. His Iberian origins provided him with independence from both Roman and traditional Armenian aristocratic factions, while his proven capabilities offered practical advantages that transcended questions of authenticity. Most importantly, his willingness to balance between Eastern and Western influences demonstrated that successful Armenian rulers needed diplomatic rather than prowess. Germanicus's Eastern mission revealed how Armenian affairs had become central to Roman strategic planning in ways that previous generations of leaders might not have anticipated. His elaborate ceremonies installing Zeno-Artaxias were designed not just to demonstrate Roman power, but to establish precedents for future interventions. The message was clear. While Armenia might choose its rulers, those choices required Roman approval to be considered legitimate. These ceremonial displays served multiple audiences simultaneously. Armenian nobles observed Roman strength while being reminded of the benefits that cooperation could provide. Parthian diplomats witnessed Roman determination to maintain influence in regions they considered within their sphere of interest. Most importantly, Roman public opinion received reassurance that Eastern affairs remained under control, despite the obvious limitations on direct Roman authority. Corbulo's Eastern operations during the mid-1st century represented the most systematic Roman attempt to resolve the Armenian question through decisive action. His methodical approach to siege warfare, combined with careful attention to supply lines and communication networks, enabled him to achieve tactical successes that previous commanders had been unable to sustain. Yet even his victories ultimately demonstrated that solutions to the Armenian problem required commitments that exceeded what Rome was willing to provide on a permanent basis. Siege of Artashat showcased Roman expertise, while revealing the fundamental dilemma that faced all foreign powers attempting to control Armenian regions. Corbulo's legions could capture and destroy any Armenian city, but they could not remain permanently to prevent its reconstruction under new leadership. Systematic demolition of Artashat's fortifications eliminated immediate threats to Roman interests, while creating lasting resentment that would complicate future diplomatic relationships. Tiridates II's installation by Parthian troops initiated a conflict that would drag on for over a decade, while consuming enormous resources that both empires needed for other purposes. His initial success in expelling Roman clients demonstrated Parthian strength, while revealing Roman vulnerabilities. But his inability to consolidate control over Armenian regions showed that Eastern armies faced similar limitations when operating far from their bases. Battle of Randea provided a dramatic illustration of how events could achieve decisive results only when combined with political arrangements that addressed underlying causes of conflict. Corbulo's tactical victory over Parthian troops created opportunities for negotiation, but only the subsequent diplomatic settlement established frameworks that could provide lasting stability. The agreement reached at Randeia would govern Roman-Parthian relations in Armenia for over a century. Treaty provisions negotiated at Randeia reflected sophisticated understanding of how competing interests could be reconciled through carefully crafted compromises. Tiridates retained his throne and his Armenian identity, but he received formal investiture from Nero in Rome, symbolically acknowledging Roman suzerainty while preserving Parthian influence over the selection process. This arrangement satisfied the prestige requirements of both empires, while providing Armenia with guarantees that neither power would attempt complete annexation. Ceremonial aspects of Tiridates' journey to Rome demonstrated how diplomatic theatre could serve substantive political purposes. His elaborate progress through the empire, accompanied by thousands of Parthian and Armenian nobles, provided Roman audiences with visible evidence of Eastern submission, while allowing Parthian and Armenian participants to observe Roman wealth and strength. Most importantly, the ceremonies established precedents for future successions that would reduce the likelihood of conflicts over Armenian affairs. Religious implications of the Randeia settlement proved equally significant for long-term developments. Tiridates' Zoroastrian faith, acknowledged and respected during his Roman visit, established precedents for religious tolerance that would influence later policies. When Armenian rulers eventually converted to Christianity, the frameworks developed during this period would facilitate Roman acceptance of religious changes that might otherwise have been seen as threats to authority. Economic benefits flowing from renewed stability encouraged commercial development that strengthened Armenia's position as an intermediary between the eastern and western portions of the empire. Trade routes that had been disrupted by decades of warfare reopened, while merchants from both Roman and Parthian regions found profitable opportunities in Armenian markets. This commercial prosperity provided Armenian rulers with resources needed for maintaining domestic stability while meeting obligations to their patrons. Sanatruk's reign during the late 1st century demonstrated how successful Armenian rulers could maintain their authority through periods of transition. When conflict between Rome and Parthia temporarily disrupted the careful balance established at Randeia, he avoided choosing sides in ways that might have invited retaliation from either empire. Instead, he focused on internal development that strengthened his kingdom's capacity to survive external pressures while remaining valuable to both potential patrons. Agricultural improvements implemented during this period reflected lessons learned from observing methods while adapting them to Armenian conditions. Irrigation networks were expanded, using techniques that combined Roman principles with traditional Armenian hydraulic knowledge. Crop diversification programs increased productivity while reducing vulnerability to weather variations that could threaten food security during periods of political instability. Developments during the late 1st and early 2nd centuries revealed how external pressures could paradoxically stimulate internal creativity rather than simply imposing foreign models. Armenian artistic traditions incorporated elements from Roman and Parthian sources while maintaining distinctive characteristics that reflected local aesthetic preferences. Literary works produced during this period combined classical forms with Armenian historical themes, creating synthetic traditions that would influence regional intellectual development for centuries. Religious architecture from this era demonstrates similar patterns of creative adaptation. Temples built under various Armenian rulers featured elements drawn from multiple traditions while serving spiritual needs that reflected the complex religious landscape emerging in Armenian society. Zoroastrian fire altars coexisted with Greek-style temples, while traditional Armenian sacred sites continued receiving veneration according to ancestral customs. Aksidara's installation marked the beginning of a new phase in Armenian affairs that would test the durability of frameworks established at Randeia. Trajan's eastern ambitions required more reliable Armenian cooperation than previous emperors had demanded, while Parthian responses threatened to transform Armenia once again into a battlefield between competing empires. The resulting conflicts would demonstrate both the strengths and limitations of client kingship as a solution to competition. Trajan's annexation of Armenia represented the most ambitious Roman attempt to resolve Eastern affairs through direct integration rather than client relationships. His creation of the province of Armenia reflected confidence that Roman capabilities had evolved sufficiently to govern regions that had previously proven ungovernable. Yet the immediate rebellions that followed this annexation demonstrated that political integration required more than conquest and efficiency. Parthomespai's brief reign under Roman auspices illustrated the complexities involved in creating legitimate authority through foreign intervention. Despite his Parthian royal ancestry and his careful attention to Armenian customs, his obvious dependence on Roman support undermined his credibility with Armenian nobles who preferred uncertain independence to certain subordination. His overthrow within months of Trajan's death revealed how client rulers could survive only when they possessed genuine local support as well as foreign backing. Hadrian's restoration of Armenian client kingship reflected hard-won Roman wisdom about the limitations of direct governance in distinct regions. His installation of Vologases II as Armenian king acknowledged that stable client relationships required rulers who possessed independent sources of legitimacy rather than simple dependence on favor. This return to earlier policies would establish patterns that would govern Roman-Armenian relations for the remainder of the period. Economic recovery following the restoration of client kingship demonstrated how political stability could rapidly translate into material prosperity. Trade routes that had been disrupted by warfare reopened, while agricultural productivity recovered from the devastation caused by conflict. Most importantly, Armenian merchants regained access to both Roman and Parthian markets, enabling commercial relationships that provided the kingdom with resources needed for maintaining independence within the constraints imposed by competition. Flourishing during the Middle Period reflected increasing confidence that Armenian identity could survive and even benefit from engagement with broader civilizations. Artistic production reached new levels of sophistication as local craftsmen incorporated techniques learned from foreign masters while maintaining aesthetic traditions that reflected distinctive Armenian sensibilities. Literary works produced during this era combined classical forms with Armenian historical themes, creating intellectual traditions that would influence regional development for centuries. Religious developments during this period laid crucial groundwork for the spiritual transformation that would eventually define Armenian civilization. Zoroastrian influences, strengthened through Parthian connections, merged with traditional Armenian beliefs and emerging Christian ideas to create synthetic religious frameworks that prepared the intellectual foundations for later conversion. Temple architecture from this era reveals how different spiritual traditions could coexist within unified sacred spaces that served diverse community needs. As the 2nd century drew to its close, Armenia had achieved a delicate equilibrium that enabled survival and even prosperity within the constraints imposed by competition between great powers. Neither fully independent nor completely subordinated, the kingdom had developed institutions and practices that could adapt to changing external circumstances while preserving essential elements of Armenian identity. This balance would soon face its greatest test as new pressures emerged that would transform not just Armenia, but the entire structure of power in the ancient world. Fire consumed the Parthian capital as Ardashir's armies swept through Ctesiphon's ancient streets. The last Arsacid emperor fell defending his throne, ending 4.5 centuries of Parthian dominion over the Iranian plateau. Yet from this catastrophe, an unexpected inheritance emerged. The Arsacid princes who had governed Armenia as Parthian vassals found themselves suddenly independent, ruling a kingdom that would become the last bastion of a dynasty that had once commanded territories from the Euphrates to the Indus River. Ardashir I, founder of the new Sassanid dynasty, brought to power a revolutionary vision that would transform the Eastern world as dramatically as Rome had once reshaped the West. Unlike their Parthian predecessors, who had ruled through loose confederations of semi-autonomous vassals, the new rulers pursued centralized control, backed by an aggressive religious ideology that demanded uniformity of belief as well as political submission. Fire worship, elevated from royal preference to state doctrine, became the instrument through which the new dynasty sought to forge unified identity among their diverse subjects. This transformation posed existential threats to highland autonomy that went far beyond previous political challenges. Where Parthian overlords had been content with tribute and cooperation, the new policy demanded spiritual as well as temporal submission. Fire temples constructed throughout the empire served not merely religious functions, but political ones, proclaiming royal power while suppressing local traditions that might foster resistance to central control. Khosrow, the first of Armenia, descendant of the Parthian Arsacid line, faced impossible choices as pressure intensified during the middle decades of the 3rd century. Outright resistance would invite the overwhelming retaliation that had destroyed the Parthian Empire, yet submission would require abandoning the religious practices that legitimized his rule among highland nobles. His efforts to navigate between these extremes established patterns of calculated defiance that would characterize highland responses to Persian pressure for generations. Resistance took forms that reflected sophisticated understanding of how small kingdoms could survive pressure from great empires. Rather than attempting futile confrontations, highland leaders pursued strategies of passive resistance combined with diplomatic maneuvering, designed to exploit tensions between the new Persian dynasty and Roman power. This approach required extraordinary patience and political skill, but it enabled Armenia to preserve essential elements of its identity while avoiding the destruction that befell more openly defiant neighbors. Religious persecution, initiated by the new regime, revealed the intimate connection between spiritual beliefs and political loyalty in the ancient world. Traditional highland practices, particularly the veneration of ancestral spirits and local deities, were condemned as barriers to the religious uniformity that the new ideology demanded. Fire temples constructed in highland cities served not merely as centers of worship, but as symbols of foreign dominion that local populations were required to acknowledge through public ceremonies. Yet persecution often produces unexpected consequences. As Persian pressure intensified, many highlanders found themselves drawn to alternative spiritual traditions that offered both resistance to official doctrine and intellectual frameworks sophisticated enough to compete with fire worship. The faith of Christ, spreading eastward through trade routes and missionary activity, provided exactly such an alternative. Its emphasis on spiritual rather than temporal sovereignty offered ideological foundations for resistance to Persian claims of divine mandate. Growth of communities devoted to Christ during the 3rd century occurred gradually through processes that modern scholars can observe but not fully reconstruct. Merchants traveling along trade routes that connected the highlands to Syria and Anatolia brought news of the new faith alongside their commercial goods. Educated highlanders studying in Roman cities encountered intellectuals whose theological arguments provided sophisticated alternatives to both traditional highland beliefs and Persian fire worship. Most significantly, the new faith offered theological frameworks that could legitimize resistance to earthly rulers who claimed divine sanction for their policies. Where Persian doctrine presented the king as Ahura Mazda's earthly representative, whose commands carried divine mandate, the teachings of Christ emphasized loyalty to heavenly rather than earthly kingdoms. This distinction provided intellectual foundations for challenging Persian claims while maintaining spiritual integrity. Tiridates III's accession to the Highland throne around 287 marked the beginning of developments that would transform not only Armenia but the entire world of faith. Unlike his predecessors, who had focused primarily on political survival, Tiridates possessed both the ambition and the opportunity to pursue more aggressive policies toward his Persian neighbors. His early reign demonstrated typical patterns of highland resistance, calculated defiance combined with diplomatic maneuvering designed to exploit Roman-Persian tensions. Yet Tiridates also inherited problems that purely political solutions could not address. Decades of religious persecution had created deep divisions within highland society, between those who accommodated Persian demands and those who maintained traditional practices at considerable personal risk. These divisions threatened to undermine the social cohesion necessary for sustained resistance, while providing Persian rulers with opportunities to exploit internal conflicts. Into this volatile situation stepped a figure whose personal story embodied the religious and political tensions transforming the ancient world. Gregory, later known as the Illuminator, belonged to a noble Highland family that had been displaced by earlier political upheavals. Educated in communities of believers within the Roman Empire, he returned to Armenia, carrying both aristocratic credentials that provided access to royal circles and religious convictions that would ultimately revolutionize Highland civilization. The Illuminator's early relationship with Tiridates reflected the complex personal and political dynamics that shaped religious transformation in the ancient world. As members of the Highland nobility, both men understood the political implications of religious choices in ways that transcended purely spiritual considerations. Their initial conflicts arose not from theological disagreements, but from the practical question of how Highland leaders should respond to Persian pressure, while maintaining their rule among their own subjects. Persecution of the Illuminator by Tiridates, culminating in his imprisonment at Urartu, became one of the most dramatic episodes in early history of the faith. For 13 years, Gregory languished in the underground prison, while Tiridates pursued policies that attempted to balance Highland independence against Persian demands. This lengthy imprisonment served multiple symbolic functions. It demonstrated royal power while preserving the holy man's life. It satisfied Persian expectations while avoiding permanent solutions that might have broader consequences. During Gregory's imprisonment, events were unfolding that would fundamentally alter the religious landscape throughout the Roman world. Constantine's embrace of the faith of Christ and his subsequent victory at the Milvian Bridge demonstrated that the new religion could be compatible with political success rather than necessarily leading to martyrdom. These developments provided new models for how rulers devoted to Christ might exercise power while maintaining their spiritual commitments. Meanwhile, within the highlands themselves, communities of believers continued growing, despite official persecution. Underground networks preserved the teachings while developing distinctive Highland theological traditions that combined universal doctrines with elements that reflected local conditions and concerns. These communities created institutional foundations that would prove crucial when official policy eventually changed. Legend and history intertwine in accounts of Tiridates' transformation, but the political logic underlying this change remains clear. By the late 3rd century, continued resistance to Persian pressure required allies who could provide both spiritual legitimacy and practical support. Roman believers, newly legitimized by Constantine's embrace of their faith, offered exactly such alliance. Moreover, the new religion provided ideological frameworks that could unite Highland resistance, while distinguishing it from both Persian fire worship and traditional Highland paganism. Tiridates' decision to release Gregory from Khor-Virap around 301 initiated developments whose significance extended far beyond the Highlands' borders. The Illuminator's emergence after 13 years of imprisonment provided dramatic evidence of divine favor that validated the new faith's claims while demonstrating the inadequacy of persecution as a means of suppressing religious movements. His subsequent role in transforming the Highland court established precedents that would influence religious expansion throughout the ancient world. The kingdom's embrace of the faith of Christ represented more than simple adoption of new religious practices. It constituted a comprehensive revolution that transformed every aspect of Highland civilization. Legal systems were revised to incorporate the new ethical principles. Educational institutions were restructured around theological frameworks, and artistic traditions were redirected towards celebrating religious rather than pagan themes. Most importantly, the transformation provided the Highlands with spiritual foundations for resistance that could not be undermined through political pressure. Establishment of the Highland apostolic structure created institutional frameworks that would preserve Highland identity through centuries of foreign domination. Unlike other communities of believers that remained subordinate to Roman or Byzantine ecclesiastical oversight, the Highland institution developed independent hierarchies and distinctive theological traditions that reflected local conditions while maintaining universal doctrines. This combination of autonomy and orthodoxy enabled the religious establishment to serve both spiritual and political functions within Highland society. Gregory's role as first Catholicos established patterns of religious leadership that would influence Highland development for centuries. His combination of aristocratic background, theological education, and political sophistication created a model for ecclesiastical power that could function effectively within the complex relationships that governed Highland society. Future religious leaders would need similar combinations of spiritual commitment and practical skills to maintain their position during periods of external pressure. Construction of sacred buildings throughout the Highlands during the early 4th century demonstrated both the sincerity of transformation and the resources available to support religious institutions. These structures, designed according to principles that combined liturgical requirements with Highland construction traditions, created sacred spaces that served multiple community functions. They provided centers for worship, education, and social assistance, while proclaiming religious identity through their physical presence within Highland cities and villages. Educational programs initiated by the early Highland religious establishment laid foundations for intellectual developments that would transform the region's culture. Schools associated with sacred buildings provided instruction in theology while preserving traditional Highland historical knowledge and literary traditions. These institutions produced educated clergy who could serve both spiritual and administrative functions within communities that were adapting to new practices while maintaining their distinctiveness. Diplomatic implications of the Highland transformation created new opportunities and challenges in the kingdom's relationships with neighboring powers. Religious identity provided foundations for closer cooperation with the Roman Empire, particularly after Constantine's own embrace of the faith legitimized the new religion as acceptable for political leaders. However, the change also intensified conflicts with Persia, where fire-worshipping rulers viewed the transformed highlands as a theological as well as political threat. Persian response to Highland transformation demonstrated how religious differences could exacerbate political conflicts in the ancient world. Shapur the Khus' policies toward the highlands combined traditional concerns about political loyalty with new anxieties about religious orthodoxy. The transformed kingdom represented not merely a rebellious vassal, but a theological challenge that threatened the religious foundations of Persian rule throughout their empire. Persecution of Highland believers during Shapur II's reign tested the durability of recent transformation, while demonstrating the political implications of religious choice. Attempts to force Highland leaders to renounce their new faith and embrace fire worship revealed how completely spiritual and temporal power had become intertwined in Persian ideology. Highland resistance to these demands established patterns of religious steadfastness that would characterize their responses to future persecution. Economic consequences of transformation proved equally significant for Highland development. Religious networks provided access to commercial relationships that transcended political boundaries while creating markets for Highland products in communities of believers throughout the Roman Empire. Monastic institutions that emerged during this period became important economic as well as spiritual centers, developing agricultural and craft production that enhanced Highland prosperity while supporting charitable activities. Transformation accompanying the new faith revealed how its theology could enhance rather than suppress distinctive Highland traditions. Historical narratives were reinterpreted to demonstrate divine providence in Highland development, while genealogical traditions were adapted to show connections between Highland noble families and biblical figures. These adaptations created religious Highland identity that maintained distinctiveness while participating in universal civilization of faith. Artistic developments during the early religious period established aesthetic traditions that would influence Highland culture for centuries. Sacred building decoration programs combined religious iconographic themes with artistic techniques that reflected Highland preferences. Manuscript illumination, developed to serve liturgical needs, created opportunities for artistic expression that celebrated both religious doctrine and Highland historical achievements. Legal reforms implemented during the early religious period demonstrated how spiritual transformation could reshape social as well as spiritual relationships. The new ethical principles influenced modifications to traditional Highland legal practices, particularly regarding family relationships, property rights, and community obligations. These changes created legal frameworks that reflected religious values while maintaining practical approaches to social organization that had evolved over centuries of Highland experience. By the end of the 3rd century, the Highlands had achieved a transformation that positioned the kingdom to survive the challenges that would soon test every aspect of its newly acquired religious identity. The change had provided spiritual foundations for resistance to Persian pressure, while creating opportunities for cooperation with Roman believers. Most importantly, the new faith had given Highlanders institutional and intellectual frameworks that could preserve their identity even if their political independence were temporarily lost. Yet challenges lay ahead that would test every aspect of highland religious life. Persian pressure would intensify as Eastern rulers recognized the threat that the transformed kingdom posed to their rule throughout the region. Internal theological disputes would emerge that would require sophisticated responses from highland religious leaders. Most significantly, the question of how to maintain highland religious identity while accommodating the political realities of foreign domination would soon demand answers that would influence highland civilization for millennia to come. The transformation was complete, but the real work had only begun. When Tiridates III proclaimed his kingdom's devotion to Christ, he created something unprecedented in the ancient world. A state where faith would shape law, where theology would guide policy, and where spiritual commitment would define resistance against imperial pressure. Yet this bold experiment faced immediate challenges that would test whether conviction could sustain sovereignty against overwhelming military forces. Gregory the Illuminator's first task as Catholicos required nothing less than rebuilding Armenian civilization from its spiritual foundations upward. The infrastructure of paganism, temples, priesthoods, ritual calendars, legal precedents, had to be systematically replaced with frameworks that could serve both sacred and secular functions. This transformation demanded administrative skills as much as theological vision, for the new faith needed practical structures that could govern daily life while maintaining spiritual authenticity. Sacred architecture became the most visible symbol of this revolution. Throughout the kingdom, ancient fire temples were either demolished or converted into houses of worship that proclaimed the new allegiance. The cathedral built at Etchmiadzin established architectural principles that would influence building for centuries. Cruciform layouts that combined liturgical functionality with defensive capabilities, thick stone walls that could withstand both weather and warfare, and tower complexes that served as both bell towers and watchtowers. Yet the most crucial foundation for the kingdom's future lay not in stone, but in letters. Mesrop Mashtots, a monk and scholar working under royal patronage, understood that lasting autonomy required intellectual as well as spiritual freedom. Around 405, after years of study that took him from Constantinople to Alexandria, he achieved what many thought impossible: the creation of a unique alphabet perfectly adapted to the sounds and structures of the Armenian language. Mashtot's 36 characters represented far more than a technical achievement. For the first time in their history, Armenians possessed a writing system that belonged entirely to them, free from dependence on foreign alphabets that carried foreign assumptions. The new letters enabled precise recording of local pronunciation while providing tools for rendering sacred texts without losing theological nuance. Most importantly, they created the foundation for independent intellectual life that could preserve Armenian distinctiveness regardless of circumstances. Rendering the Bible into Armenian became the new alphabet's first and greatest achievement. Working with teams of scholars who possessed expertise in Greek, Syriac, and Latin texts, Mashtots produced a version that combined theological accuracy with literary beauty. The Armenian Bible became more than scripture. It emerged as the foundation document of a national literature that would preserve memory through centuries of foreign domination. This project required innovations that went beyond simple linguistic conversion. Theological concepts that had no equivalents in traditional Armenian thought demanded new vocabulary that could convey complex ideas while remaining accessible to ordinary believers. Legal passages needed adaptation to local customs without compromising scriptural mandates. Historical narratives required bridges that could connect biblical events to Armenian experience while maintaining universal relevance. Educational revolution followed naturally from these literary achievements. Schools established in monasteries and urban centers provided instruction that combined sacred education with practical skills needed for administration and commerce. Young Armenians learned to read and write in their own language, while mastering Greek and Latin texts that connected them to broader intellectual networks. This bilingual education created a generation of leaders capable of functioning in international contexts while maintaining national authenticity. Monastic communities emerged as centers of both spiritual and economic activity that would sustain Armenian civilization through its darkest periods. These establishments combined prayer and labor according to principles that made them largely self-sufficient, while generating surpluses that could support charitable work and scholarly activities. Monasteries became repositories of manuscripts, centers of agricultural innovation, and networks of communication that transcended borders. Legal transformation proved equally comprehensive and challenging. Traditional Armenian law codes, based on clan relationships and customary practices, required modification to reflect principles derived from scripture and theological reflection. Marriage customs, inheritance rules, commercial regulations, and criminal penalties all needed revision that could maintain social stability while implementing sacred requirements. The synthesis that emerged preserved essential elements of Armenian legal tradition while incorporating biblical and canonical principles. Family law emphasized community obligations while protecting individual rights. Commercial regulations encouraged honest dealing while providing frameworks for resolving disputes. Criminal codes maintained proportional justice while offering opportunities for redemption and reconciliation. Sassanid response to these developments revealed how completely sacred and secular power had become intertwined in Persian ideology. Yazdegerd I's initial tolerance gave way to systematic persecution under his successor, Bahram V, who recognized that Armenian autonomy posed theological as well as military threats to Persian rule. The persecution that followed would test every aspect of the foundations that had been constructed during the kingdom's first century of faith. Sahak the Great's leadership during this crisis demonstrated how clerical oversight could provide stability when secular structures faced overwhelming pressure. As both Catholicos and member of the royal family, Sahak embodied the fusion of sacred and temporal leadership that enabled Armenian resistance to foreign domination. His educational reforms, literary patronage, and diplomatic activities created frameworks that could preserve Armenian distinctiveness even when sovereignty was temporarily lost. The golden age of Armenian literature that flourished under Sahak's patronage established intellectual traditions that would influence regional development for millennia. Historical works like those of Agathangelos and Faustus provided authoritative accounts of recent transformation while placing Armenian experience within universal frameworks. Theological treatises explored doctrinal questions while developing distinctively Armenian approaches to spiritual practice. Liturgical compositions created worship traditions that combined universal elements with local expressions. The movement to render foreign texts into Armenian brought the intellectual heritage of the ancient world into national culture through carefully selected works that could enhance understanding while preserving authenticity. Greek theological texts, Syrian spiritual writings, and selected classical works were rendered into Armenian by scholars who possessed both linguistic expertise and theological sophistication. Yet even as achievements reached unprecedented heights, pressures were building that would soon overwhelm the kingdom's capacity for independent resistance. The Roman-Persian partition agreement of 387 divided Armenian territories, between competing empires according to strategic considerations that ignored ethnic and sacred unity. This division created new challenges that would test whether Armenian distinctiveness could survive fragmentation of sovereignty. Eastern regions, assigned to Persian control, faced immediate pressure to abandon their allegiance to Christ and accept Zoroastrian orthodoxy. Western territories, incorporated into the Roman sphere, experienced different but equally serious challenges as Byzantine rulers sought to subordinate the Armenian hierarchy to Constantinople's control. These pressures threatened to destroy the sacred unity that had become the foundation of Armenian distinctiveness. Vardan Mamikonian's emergence as leader of resistance to Persian persecution embodied the transformation of Armenian Christianity from personal conviction to national ideology. Unlike earlier resistance movements that had focused primarily on territorial autonomy, Vardan's coalition understood that ethnic and spiritual survival required armed resistance to forced conversion. The rebellion he organized would become the defining moment when sacred conviction and resistance merged into unified Armenian consciousness. Preparation for confrontation with Persian forces revealed how completely Armenian society had been transformed by its commitment to Christ. Noble families who had previously competed for royal favor now united behind sacred principles that transcended traditional clan loyalties. Monastic communities provided both spiritual support and practical assistance to resistance efforts. Most importantly, ordinary Armenians demonstrated willingness to risk everything rather than abandon the faith that had become central to their existence. Battle of Avarer in 451 tested these commitments in the crucible of warfare against overwhelming odds. Vardan's forces, though outnumbered and out-equipped, fought with determination that shocked Persian commanders who had expected easy victory over rebellious vassals. The Armenian defeat, in purely military terms, became spiritual victory that established patterns of heroic resistance that would inspire future generations. Vardan's death in battle transformed him from rebel leader into martyr, whose example would define Armenian responses to foreign pressure for centuries. His willing sacrifice for faith, rather than expedient submission to superior force, created a model of heroic resistance that combined spiritual conviction with defiance. The cult that developed around his memory preserved Armenian consciousness during periods when sovereignty seemed impossible. Persian victory at Avarer proved Pyrrhic in ways that became apparent only gradually. Military success had been purchased at costs that made continued occupation increasingly difficult, while Armenian resistance had demonstrated that sacred conviction could motivate opposition that pressure alone could never overcome. The compromises that followed acknowledged these realities while preserving essential elements of Armenian autonomy. Council of Ashtayshat in 449 had already established frameworks that would enable Armenian independence regardless of circumstances. Armenian leaders, meeting under Persian pressure to accept Zoroastrian doctrine, instead formulated distinctive positions that maintained Orthodox faith while asserting institutional autonomy. These decisions would influence Armenian development long after questions had been resolved through different means. Rejection of the Council of Chalcedon's Christological formulations in 451 reflected Armenian determination to maintain theological independence from both Roman and Persian oversight. Armenian hierarchs, led by Catholicos Gute, argued that Chalcedon's distinctions were both unnecessary and dangerous to proper understanding of divine nature. This position established Armenian autonomy that would endure for centuries. The arguments that supported this independence combined sophisticated analysis of scriptural and patristic sources with practical recognition that Armenian autonomy was essential for survival. Armenian theologians developed Christological positions that maintained Orthodox faith while rejecting formulae that might subject their hierarchy to foreign control. These positions, though controversial, provided foundations for institutional independence that circumstances alone could not have sustained. Final collapse of Armenian sovereignty in 428 marked the end of the ancient period, but not the end of Armenian civilization. When the last Arsacid king was deposed, and Armenian territories were formally incorporated into Persian administrative structures, the institutional and intellectual foundations established during the century and a quarter of independence proved strong enough to preserve essential elements of Armenian distinctiveness. Persian administrative integration proceeded according to principles that acknowledged the impossibility of destroying Armenian autonomy through means alone. Armenian nobles retained local oversight while accepting Persian supervision. Armenian leaders maintained hierarchical independence while avoiding direct confrontation with Persian policy, and Armenian institutions continued functioning while adapting to new realities. Economic prosperity that characterized the final decades of independence provided material foundations that would sustain Armenian civilization through centuries of foreign rule. Agricultural productivity, enhanced through innovations and careful land management, generated surpluses that could support activities even when resources were diverted to Persian purposes. Commercial networks, developed through connections and traditional trade relationships, provided access to external resources while maintaining Armenian economic independence. Achievements that defined this final period established intellectual traditions that would influence Armenian civilization for millennia. The historical works, theological treatises, liturgical compositions, and legal codes produced during the Golden Age created literary heritage that preserved Armenian consciousness regardless of circumstances. Most importantly, the educational establishments and monastic communities that had nurtured these achievements provided frameworks for transmitting knowledge to future generations. As Persian administrators took control of Armenian territories, and the last echoes of sovereignty faded into memory, the experiment in fusion of faith and nationhood had achieved something unprecedented in the ancient world. Armenian Christianity had become more than belief. It had evolved into comprehensive consciousness that could survive the loss of independence while preserving essential characteristics that distinguished Armenian civilization from all others. The ancient period of Armenian history had ended, but the foundations established during its final century would prove more durable than any institution. The alphabet that had given Armenians intellectual freedom, the literature that had preserved their memory, the establishments that had sustained their spiritual life, and the legal traditions that had governed their social relationships would all survive to shape Armenian responses to whatever challenges the future might bring. In monasteries scattered throughout the mountains, scribes continued copying manuscripts that preserved the intellectual heritage of ancient Armenian civilization. In village schools, teachers continued instructing children in the letters and literature that maintained continuity. In cathedral centers, clergy continued celebrating liturgies that proclaimed Armenian consciousness. The kingdom had fallen, but the intellectual and spiritual foundations of Armenian civilization endured, ready to support whatever new forms of freedom future generations might achieve.